Hey everybody, we'll get started here in about a minute or so. I guess 2 o'clock on the East Coast, 11 a.m. on the West Coast. Thank you so much for joining us for our webinar today on Introduction to Angular 4. We are going to talk a little bit about Angular 4. We're going to go through some slides and go through some code demonstrations and stuff. And I just want to thank you guys for being a part of it and for joining us today. As we go throughout the presentation, if you have any questions or anything like that, feel free to chat me. All right, so my name is Eric Greene, and this webinar is brought to you by Wintellect now, or brought to you by Wintellect. Wintellect does consulting, programming services, training, you name it, in the programming space, especially when it comes to Microsoft and web-related technologies. They are outstanding. If you have a need for any types of services related to software development, I highly encourage you to check them out. They also have an on-demand training service called Wintellect Now, and there you can go learn about the cutting-edge web development technologies, Microsoft technologies, Azure, stuff like that. So I encourage you to go check that out as well if you get a chance. So let's get started here with our little presentation. We're going to go first through a couple of slides, and then we'll do some live coding. And then at the end of the live coding, we'll have about 10 minutes or so to answer some questions. We'll go till about 12, or I guess we'll go to about 12:05, 12:10 Pacific time, or 3:05, 3:10 Eastern time. The session is being recorded, so you can actually go back and download it later if you'd like to rewatch any of the stuff. Also, at the end of the presentation, I'll give you a link to the GitHub repository where you can actually pull down all of the code demos if you want to make use of them in your own projects. So the first question is, what exactly is Angular? I mean, why spend time learning about this framework? Why spend time building UIs and stuff like that for applications in the web browser? So the web browser, whether it's on a desktop device or a mobile device, what have you, or whether it's through something called the Electron platform for building desktop applications, the web browser and working with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript has kind of become the de facto standard way of building modern UIs. And what Angular is going to allow us to do is give us a framework that we can use to actually make it easier to build UIs within that environment. But it's even better than that. Angular not only will work in a web browser environment, but when you combine it with other technologies, you can actually use it to build UIs for mobile devices and stuff like that. So the question is, what problem does Angular solve? First of all, Angular does not solve the problem of building server-side data services. So when you go to work with Angular, we're not talking about building PHP pages or JSP pages or setting up REST services. We're literally talking about building UI code that, at least from the perspective of our webinar here, runs inside of a web browser. It's going to provide you all types of solutions for pulling in data from those data services, displaying data inside of component-based views, as well as giving us a mechanism for organizing those views and that logic that's inside of them. Now, Angular is a framework. It's more than just a library. If you were using something, let's say, like React, React is a library. It solves a certain set of problems. But Angular actually tries to solve all the problems that relate to working with a UI environment. It does more than just give you components. It actually gives you a bunch of additional structures like modules and HTTP services and stuff like that to kind of build the whole solution. Okay? Probably the most important part of working with Angular is what I call component-driven development. So the thing with component-driven development is that when you're working with components, you're not looking at your UI as like one big monolithic UI. Instead, what you're trying to do is take that big UI and decompose it into smaller pieces, and then recompose those pieces back together to then build that larger UI. Okay? Now, there's lots of different component libraries out there. As we keep mentioning, React is probably the big one that competes with Angular in this space. The principles that you would use to code with Angular or React or what have you, that component-driven development, those principles are actually the same across the board. It's just which API are you using to do that. Now, Angular components, unlike React components, actually do try to kind of implement a certain set of standards called web components, which we'll talk about in a second. The goal of React was not to create web components, but instead to basically have a really fast, optimized way of updating the DOM in response to model changes. But where Angular comes in is Angular actually says, hey, what are some of the standards around this whole component-based way of thinking? And let's see if we can incorporate some of that into the framework. And so that's what Angular does. So let's talk briefly here about web components. Web components are really based upon 4 different W3C standards. One of them is called custom elements, HTML imports, templates, and the shadow DOM. Custom elements are used for components. So when you see me do some Angular code here shortly, you're going to see where I'm using custom elements to reference the various components that are in my system. HTML imports are not really needed by Angular because it's all using the ES 2015 module system. So there really is no HTML imports part of this, even though that's kind of part of web components. It's not really part of Angular. Templates. Structural directives in Angular use something called ng template. Now, in earlier versions of Angular 2, it actually did use something called the template element, which is part of web components. In Angular 4, it uses an element called ng template to kind of differentiate it from the template element. Nevertheless, the concept is still the same. The idea in web components is you can have a template, and that template basically doesn't do anything until it's needed. It's not rendered on the screen or anything like that. Well, Angular's web components support that same concept with structural directives. The ability to have this template defined that doesn't do anything until it's time for it to do something. And so that's the third part of web components. The last part is the shadow DOM. Now, Angular provides support for the shadow DOM. It basically allows you to isolate one part of the DOM tree from the rest of the DOM tree. And the support for the shadow DOM by Angular can either be the real shadow DOM, which at the moment only really Chrome supports, or it can be emulated support, which works across all the browsers. And so the default mechanism inside of Angular is to use a polyfill to actually give emulated support for the shadow DOM. So while Angular is not a perfect implementation of web components, they've made a lot of efforts to kind of get, to strive along with that and work with components in that way. Angular works on the following platforms. It'll work on web browsers, which is our focus in class today, but you can also use it on the Electron framework. So if you've ever used things like Visual Studio Code or Atom or the client for Slack, all of that is built with Electron, which is basically a Chromium front end with a Node back end and using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to code up the UI. And as part of that, you can use Angular to code up the JavaScript aspect of that. You can also do native iOS and Android applications with Angular with native script. And you can also do server rendering. And what's nice about that is, especially if you want to do ahead-of-time compilation, you can use the server rendering capabilities of Angular to basically render out your components ahead of time and then pass down that compiled component code down into your actual Angular application. So the question is, what about React? Well, React rocks. React is awesome. Nothing wrong with React at all. I use it all the time. I use Angular all the time. They both solve a similar problem and using similar concepts, but with significantly different APIs, different ways to go about solving things. The thing with React, though, is that React is just one library of part of a larger set of libraries you need to solve all your problems. Now, if you're really picky about how you solve each little problem in your application, and you want to pick all the different libraries, then React might be a better solution for you. But if you instead are looking to have a solution where all the pieces are put together for you, you just want to get busy writing code to solve your business problem, Angular will probably be a great solution for you to do that. Now, concerning the native iOS and Android stuff, to my knowledge, based upon most recent information, React Native is still better at that than doing the native script with Angular, but I would imagine over the course of time, both of them will have parity with each other in terms of capabilities and building these actual native applications and stuff like that. But if you need a native application today, you'd probably go with React Native. Nevertheless, the direction that Angular is going is the ability to support all of this cross-platform development, and to a large degree it already does. So what I want to do now is I want to jump into writing some code. We're going to be using Visual Studio Code as our editor, but Webpack is going to be used, and we're going to be running various transpilers to do things like transpile our TypeScript code and stuff like that. Now before we dive into the code though, I'd like to kind of find out from everybody a little bit about your background. And so I'm going to throw up a little poll here up on the screen. And I was curious, how many people in the webinar here have actually worked with JavaScript? So I'm going to launch the JavaScript poll here. If you could go ahead and just click the poll on the screen. Give folks a couple minute or so here to do this. All right, looks like we have about 73% voting here. So there's a reason I asked this question. I do a lot of training, and a lot of students that I work with, I'll ask them, have they used JavaScript before? And most folks will say yes. If you look at most people's resumes, programmers, they usually have JavaScript listed on there. But what I find is usually the case is a lot of those folks, they've used it before, they've seen it, but most of their stuff is like copying and pasting jQuery code from Stack Overflow. So that's why I gave the Stack Overflow option there, and it looks like we have like 66% of the group is basically saying, yeah, I do my JavaScript programming with Stack Overflow, and then we have about 34% of the group out there is actually JavaScript experts. So I will say this about working with Angular. When you work with Angular, you really need to know your JavaScript. I know we're using TypeScript. I know we're going to get some strong typing. Some of the ideas and principles that go into working with TypeScript, slightly different than just plain old JavaScript. But if you're going to get into this and start working with Angular, you really got to make sure you know your JavaScript. I can't tell you how many classes I've taught where people have been like, wow, I wish I would have taken a JavaScript class before I took such and such, JavaScript library class like React or Angular. So if you're not familiar with JavaScript, you definitely want to do that. One last question here for everybody. How many folks here have worked with Angular 2 or 4? Not Angular JS, the first version, but how many folks have actually worked with Angular 2 or 4? All right, looks like we're up to about 80% of the crowd voting here. So yeah, 70% of the people have not worked with Angular before. So good. So this will all be new information. For those of you who have worked with Angular before, you may not learn a whole lot. Maybe I can give you a few extra little details on some things you haven't thought about before in terms of working with Angular. Okay, cool. So let's go ahead now and take a look at some code. I'm going to exit out of PowerPoint. And let's pull that over to here. And here's our code editor. And let me do this. Okay, so here's our web browser window. I have a little Hello World page being displayed here. So there's our Hello World. Here's Visual Studio Code. I love Visual Studio Code. I use a Mac, and I do all my programming and stuff on a Mac, but Visual Studio Code has to be probably the single best text editor I've ever used. I used to use Atom before Visual Studio Code, but I find that with Visual Studio Code, it's reliable, it doesn't crash, it has great support for TypeScript built into it, even great support for working with JSX and doing React programming. So if you're looking for a good editor to use, maybe you're still using Sublime or you're using Atom or whatever, I highly recommend you check out Visual Studio Code. It's actually built on the Electron platform, so it runs on Mac, Windows, and Linux. It's just awesome. So check it out if you get a chance. Coming in here now, let's take a look at some of the code that we've got. Inside of our TypeScript folder, you'll see we have an app folder. And inside of it, there's an app.component.ts. Inside of here, you'll see we've got some component code here for our little Angular application that's displaying Hello World. So if we go back to our web browser, right there, you can actually see the Hello World that's being displayed. This Hello World text value is being set up on this property, which is a part of our app component right here. And then you can see there's our template with our message template variable inside of the span tag, just like that. Okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to build ourselves a very simple little application that's going to manage a list of colors. So it'll give us a chance to take a look at working with data, collecting some data via forms. We're going to also take our larger component and decompose it out into smaller components and then pull it all back together. We'll get to take a look at some inputs and outputs and stuff like that and kind of get a kind of a good idea of what it's like to start working with Angular and working with components. Cool. So coming back over here to our code, what I want to do is I want to change this up so that we actually have a header for our little tool that we're going to build. So I'm going to come in here and change this from using double quoted strings to using something called a template literal. The template literal is created by using backticks, and I'm going to replace the content here with a header tag, and inside the header tag we'll have an H1, and we'll just say color tool. So there's our H1, and then we'll have our slash header here. Okay? Now, you'll see that with these template literals, we can have multi-line strings. You don't see me having to put any extra special characters down here to make it go to the next line. I'm not having to do the whole plus sign where you have like a string plus then the next line. I can simply just do everything here inside of the string. In a real application, I can also move this template string out to its own file. For the purposes of our little demonstration here, we're just going to kind of do everything in the same file, but you could move it out to its own file if you wanted to. So now I have my header, color tool header. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of our little variable here. So if I save this and come back over to here, you'll see that now we have color tool. I'm using the Webpack dev server, which is basically watching for changes to files. So whenever I change the files, it recompiles everything and then produces a new output, and then it actually tells the web browser to reload itself using live reload. Now I actually have a style defined in my style sheet to make all H1 tags, big and blue. That obviously is not the default user agent style sheet style, but we have color tool there. So I'm going to take this and make this actually be displayed with the value from a variable. So I can come into here and say public header text string, and then we'll just have this say color tool. So there's color tool. Save that. I can take this header text property right here and I can actually directly paste it in just like that. With Angular, you use the double curly braces to actually set up a template expression or template variable. And so this expression will be evaluated within the context of the component instance. So when this app component gets loaded up, the instance of that component is going to have a header text property. And so it's evaluating that and outputting the header text like we have right here. So just to show you it actually changed, we'll put some exclamation points in there. We'll save that. It'll let it recompile. And there you go. So there's color tool with the exclamation points at the end of it. So right there is an example of building out a template and using a template variable and then taking that value off the component and populating it. The next thing I want to do is actually build a list. So we're going to come into here and we're going to say unordered list. Here's our unordered list. And inside of it, we're going to have a list item. And I want to take this list item and I wanted to repeat it for every value that we have in an array. So I'll come down here. I'm going to create a new array. We'll say public colors string. There we go. And then I'll just have an array of colors. We'll say red, yellow, and blue. There we go. And you'll notice that my colors there have red underlines. And the reason why that is because with TypeScript, there is a special linter called tslint that you can make use of. It works with multiple editors. I have it working here with Visual Studio Code. In fact, if you come over to my extensions, you can actually see where I have tslint installed. And my tslint rules, for whatever reason, I've configured them to require using double quotes. Well, you could imagine there's lots of things you can configure in tslint, and one of the advantages to using a linter with your code is that when you're typing it out and you make little syntax mistakes, instead of having to wait until the code runs to actually see the mistake, you can actually see the mistake inside of your editor. Okay? So there you go. So we have our red, yellow, and blue. Now what I want to do is I want to set it up so that I can iterate over these colors and display each color inside of a list item. I can do that using a structural directive called ng4. So we're going to say asterisk ng4, let color of colors, and then I'll use my template variable syntax, and I'm going to say color. So what's going to happen here is it's going to take each color off of the array, assign it to a variable called color. I can reference that color over here, and when I do, it'll then build me a list of those colors. So come back over to here, and now you can see I have a list of colors. Okay? We can actually come in here and even inspect the DOM to see what that looks like. So I'll inspect that. Come into here, you can see I have my header. That's my color tool. There's the value populated. Here I have my unordered list, and then there's my actual list items right there. Okay? So what Angular is doing for us is it's using these template variable or template expression syntax, and it's using these directives to basically build out the DOM structure or the UI structure of our view. And so we can set up all of this data here on our component, and then it'll generate this output up here. So that's an example of displaying a list. The next thing we want to be able to do is be able to actually add a color to our list. So we can do that by creating a form. So I'm going to come into here, I'm going to say form, and then I can start to build out all the various elements that I'm going to need. However, in order to do this, I'm going to need to import something called the forms module. The forms module is going to give me access to a special directive called ngModel that will allow me to set up some data binding on my form so I can type into the boxes and then have my underlying model updated with those values. So let's head over to AppModule. You'll see that AppModule is kind of the starting place actually for the application. It's inside of AppModule where we're going to pull in a bunch of different things that are necessary to get everything bootstrapped and up and working. For example, there is a module called ngModule. This ngModule is provided by Angular for Angular's module system. So when you work with Angular, you're really working with two different kinds of module systems. You're working with the ES 2015 module system, which you see with import and export. Then you're also working with Angular's module system, okay? And Angular's module system is for organizing Angular-related things, okay? That's why we say Angular is a framework versus a library. React doesn't have a module system. It doesn't have a way of organizing all the various parts of your React application. It just gives you an API for creating components. So when you work with Angular, you're actually getting a fuller, richer development environment in terms of organizing your application and working with all the different parts of things. So now I'm going to come into here and I'm going to say import forms module from @Angular forms. So now I'm pulling in my form stuff there, and I'm going to take forms module here, and I'm going to pass that into my imports. This is going to bring forms module into the application. So by importing forms module, it makes all of the various services and other directives provided by it available to my application. So now I'm going to come into here, and I'm going to set up my form. So here's my form, so we'll do a little div tag right there. And we're going to have ourselves a little label, and we'll say new color. We'll come over to our label, and we'll say for equal to, and we're going to say new color input. And then we'll come into here and we'll say input type equal to text, asterisk ng model, no, I'm sorry, asterisk ng model, banana brackets, ng model. And we're going to bind this to a new color property that we're going to define on our component. Okay? Now, in addition to that, I am going to specify the ID value so that I can connect it semantically to my label element. So I'll say ID new color input. In addition to that, I'm also going to give it a name. For various reasons, when you use ng model inside of a form, you always have to specify the name attribute. If you don't specify the name attribute, it won't work right. You'll actually get an error. And the reason for that is what Angular does behind the scenes, it actually builds an object model of all your various form controls. And it needs a name for the properties of that object model to reference this input control. So we'll say name, new color input. You can name it whatever you want. We're not actually going to use the name for anything in this example, but you can name it whatever you'd like. So there's my name, new color. Great. So now that I've got my new color input, I need to make sure that I have a new color property down here that's going to be updated with whatever value gets typed into the box. So there's our new color property. Now down here, I'm going to add a button. So there's my button, and we're going to say add color. There we go. On my button, I'm going to set the type attribute, because whenever a button is inside of a form, it'll trigger the submission process. Now, Angular actually handles that for you. You don't technically have to do type equal to button inside of Angular. But as a general practice, I do that in every framework or library I'm working with just to make sure it's not really going to try to submit the page. And then I'm going to come into here. I'm going to wire up a click event. And then I'm going to assign it a function called addColor. So now what I need to do is actually implement the addColor function so it'll take the color typed into the input box and add it to the list. So I'll come up to here, say public addColor, boom. And then I'm going to come into here and I'm going to say this dot colors is equal to this dot colors dot concat this dot new color. There we go. So now I have my public addColor function, and I'm going to take the new color I typed in, add it to the end of the list. Also, I'm going to reinitialize new color so that we now have a blank field. So you can see I'm not having to write jQuery code. I'm not having to directly interact with DOM objects to extract values. I'm not having to tell it to re-render things. I'm not having to do things like call setState. Instead, what happens is Angular literally just, when this function's done running, updates the UI, and I'm good to go. Now, the magic behind how that works has something to do with something called Zone.js. Angular is using Zone.js to basically hook into all of the asynchronous operations of the web browser, and then when you run your event handler or other asynchronous operation code, and the zone completes, it then runs its change detection cycle, which then looks for changes and updates the UI. That's kind of the auto-magical part of Angular that's happening behind the scenes. I promise you it's really not all that auto-magical once you understand how it works. It's like, oh, that's kind of a cool way to do this. So I would definitely say it's safe to use Angular, even though this feels magical. It's really not all that magical once you dive into the details of it. But for our purposes, it's nice because we don't have to remember to call these different functions to tell the UI to update. We simply do the operation we want to perform to our data model, and then Angular knows what to update in response to that. So there you go. So there's our changes. If we come over to here, we should be able to type into our little field here, except it looks like I have a little typo. Let's see here. Ah, here's my typo. Look at my input field down here. I've got this little extra quote there at the end. Let's close that off. Hate it when I do a typo like that. Come back over to here, let it reload. Ah, there's our field. So now I can type in a color, and we'll do purple. Click Add Color, and there's purple added to the list, and it's been cleared from the input box. This code that we wrote here was really super easy to do. If we were to write this same piece of code using React, it would have taken twice the amount of time to do it. And that mostly has to do with the fact that when you're working with these input fields with React, you have to write a bunch of code to support something called a controlled component that involves updating state and a bunch of different things, and it just kind of takes more time to do it. With Angular, because it's a cohesive framework and just kind of the way it's designed, they actually allow you to eliminate a lot of the boilerplate code you might see with other frameworks and libraries, and so you can actually do things much more simply. Of course, you're giving more control to Angular, so you have to kind of do things the Angular way, whereas when you are using something like a React, you have more flexibility. So you just have to choose where in that spectrum of flexibility versus, you know, up and running, really simple, easy to use, where you fit in that spectrum. I know some places where I teach, React is the right choice for them. In other places, Angular is the right choice for them. It just depends upon what their needs are. So there's a very simple example of a color tool application, but we're not done yet. As I mentioned to you at the outset, the most important part of working with Angular is working with the components and taking a larger UI and decomposing it into smaller pieces. There's a whole bunch of different reasons why that's awesome. It's awesome because you get more reusability. It's awesome because it's easier to unit test. It makes it easier to maintain components that are focused on one thing as opposed to 50 different things. Right now, our component here, while it's not overly huge or big, actually is really doing 3 different things. It's telling us how our header text is being displayed. It's telling us how to display our list. It's also managing all of our form stuff. And then, of course, we have this logic down here, which is kind of tying all those pieces together. Everything right now at the moment is very tightly coupled to each other. We want to decouple it. We want to take this and break it into smaller components and then reference those smaller components from this larger component. So let's go ahead and get started doing that. There's lots of ways you can organize your files over here in an Angular application. If you bring in 10 different Angular developers, you'll probably be told of 10 different ways to structure it. There's numerous style guides out there. We'll tell you to do it this way or that way. If you're using Angular CLI, it has its own way of structuring files. What I tell people is this. When you structure your files, make sure you do it in a way that makes sense for your application. It's easy to find files. Keep the structure as flat as possible, and keep related items together. So for example, if you had a component that had a TypeScript file, an HTML file, a CSS file, and a unit test, put those together in the same place. It makes it easier. But ultimately, at the end of the day, remember, everybody's style guides and recommendations are just that, guides and recommendations. You do it the way that makes the most sense for your application. Just make sure you know why you're doing it the way you're doing it. So for this application, what I'm going to do is simply come into App, create a new folder called Components, and then I'm going to go ahead and add my first component. What I want to do is I want to take header text, and I want to break this header out to its own component file. So I'll come into here, I'm going to say New File, and we're going to call it toolheader.component.ts. Now, you can name your files however you would like. Some folks like to do either title case or camel case file names. I like to separate the words in my file names with dashes. That's just my preferred way of doing it. When I work inside of Angular, I like to put .component or .module or .service or .pipe as part of the file name so I know what the file is. It does result in longer file names. But I have found that not to be an issue for me. It might be an issue for you. You could go for shorter file names if you like, but that's the way I do mine. So up here at the top, we're going to say import component. When you work with Angular, you'll be using named imports and exports for pulling in all the different parts of Angular. So I'm importing my component here. I'm also going to have to import something called input. Input's going to allow me to pass input into my component. So we'll say import component, comma, input from @Angular/core. Now what I'm going to do is actually set up my component. You'll see that I'm going to use the component decorator. So I was actually just having this discussion earlier this morning with a group of students. The React library uses inheritance to set up components. So if you go to create a component that needs state or lifecycle functions, you'll create a React component that extends React.component. So React uses inheritance to set up components. Angular does not. Angular actually uses these decorators, and you can kind of think of these decorators as a form of the composition pattern. So instead of using inheritance to determine what a class is going to be, they use the decorator to provide additional metadata which is attached to the class that actually tells the class what it's going to be in the Angular system. Well, one of the options we need to set is the selector. The selector will allow us to specify what custom HTML tag will be used to reference the component. So we'll say selector. Then we'll come into here and we're going to say tool header. That'll be the actual selector that we're going to use. And then, of course, we're going to need a template. Now, one nice thing about decomposition is that what you can do is come over to App Component, and you can grab this right here and simply just pull that out, and we're going to paste that right into here. There we go. So now we have our actual template there for our component. Now we need to actually build the class. We're going to say export because we're going to be exporting this component out so that we can include it in other JavaScript files. Export class, tool header. There we go. And on this class, we're going to need to define header text. But header text needs to be more than just a simple property. It actually needs to be something called an input property so that it can receive the data from the outside and then be able to display it inside of the template. So we're going to use the input decorator, and we're going to then say public header text colon string, and then we'll just initialize it to an empty value here. So now what's going to happen is we're going to pass in this input value from the outside, and when we pass in the input value, it's going to show up there inside of the template. So let's go ahead and register this component with our Angular module, or our app module, and then reference it inside of our app component so we can see it on the screen. So we're going to have to come over here to app module. We're going to have to import the class into here. So we'll say import tool header from ./component/tool header. There we go. So now we're importing tool header. I'm going to take tool header here, copy it, register it with declarations. There we go. And now I can make use of the tool header component inside of the template of app component because I've registered it in the declaration section. So I'll come back over to app component, and I'm going to replace this with a call to tool header. So there's our tool header. There we go. Now what I need to do is set this up so that I can actually pass in my header text. I can do this simply by saying header text is equal to color tool. And we'll go ahead and we'll save that, and we'll delete that property. We don't need that one. So let's save it. So now I have my string color tool being passed into header text. Looks like we have a little compilation error down here. Let's take a look. If you take a look here at our output in the terminal window, so one nice thing about Visual Studio Code is the terminal window is awesome, especially when you're working with things like Webpack and doing transpilation and everything else. This little terminal window is incredibly valuable. You can see down here when I saved my file, the Webpack process basically went to reprocess and transpile everything, and there was an error. And the error is cannot find module components tool header. And the problem is I actually named it toolheader.component, not just tool header. So I need to come back into app module here and say .component. Now save it. And now we should see that everything compiles successfully unless I made another typo. So let it compile here. Yeah, every once in a while it can be a little bit slow. Usually it's faster. I'm actually running my transpiler here in production mode. If you run it in dev mode, it runs a little faster. There we go. Now it's done. So let's reload. Now you can see I have my header. If you come in and inspect the DOM, you'll actually now see where we have our tool header custom element, and then inside of it I have header and I have my H1, so on and so forth. There are ways to work with components so that maybe you just want the header and you don't want this tool header thing here. There are ways to make that happen. We won't be covering that in this webinar, but there are ways to do that when building your components. Okay, so coming back over to here. Next on our list is we want to take our list of colors and we want to move that out to its own component. Now, When we go to do this, we need to take a step back and think about what is the purpose of our component. Is our component going to be reused? Could it be reused? You see, one of the reasons we buy into these big libraries and frameworks is to have the ability to build reusable stuff. You know, if we come at these libraries and frameworks and we kind of just take the same old approach that a lot of programmers take, where they write something, it's awesome, they want to use it again, they copy and paste the whole thing and then make a few tweaks. If we're going to do that, we don't need Angular to do that. We can just keep writing plain old-fashioned jQuery code and just copy and paste to our heart's content. The reason we learn things like Angular, React, these other libraries and frameworks, is we want to have the ability to build something that follows an API so that it's reusable, so that we can build it once and reuse it over and over and over again. This is a perfect example. There's nothing specific about this unordered list that only works with a list of colors. Okay? This unordered list could be implemented in a very generalized component that could then be used for any type of unordered list. So in this case, what we're going to do is build a component over here called unordered list.component.ts. There we go. We're going to come into here. Once again, we're going to import component. We're going to import input from @Angular core. We're going to have our component decorator once again. Of course, if you're building a real app, you can have pre-created templates and everything else. But when I do teaching, I like to kind of code everything out. It gives folks a chance to digest what this stuff is as opposed to just getting 100 lines of code in front of their face. So we're going to say selector, and we're going to say unordered list, and then we'll have our template. There we go. I'm going to come back over to app component. I'm going to pull that out, pop that into here. Now, of course, I want to change the template to be more generalized. So I'm going to say let item of items and change that to item as well. There we go. I'm going to say export class unordered list, and we'll just uppercase that U. Great. And then we're going to come into here. We need to set this up as an actual items input, so we'll just copy that. And we'll say at input public items string, and we'll just initialize it with an empty array. There we go. So now we have our unordered list component created. You can see it wasn't that big of a deal. Just copy and paste out the template, put a little scaffolding around it. I, of course, need to import this into my app module. So we'll say import, boom, from, and I'll just copy that part right there, unordered list dot component. And then we'll take our unordered list, and because it's also a component, we want to use it in a template. We'll register it in the declaration section. You want to make sure you don't forget to do that, by the way. It's very common with Angular developers to forget to register their stuff with declarations. They may even come and import it, but then they forget to copy and paste the actual class name into the declaration section. So be sure not to forget that. Come back over here to app component. Now I can simply just say unordered list items. Now what I'm going to do is, this one's going to be a little bit different property than header text. Instead of specifying a static string value, I want the string value to represent a property on app component. So I'm going to say colors like that, and then we'll close this off. So these square brackets around items basically tell Angular, evaluate this as an expression. Without the square brackets around it, it says, hey, just take this raw value and pass it into header text. So you have to remember to do that. You have to tell Angular what's the relationship between the data and the attribute value and the attribute itself that'll be passed into the component. Is it static text? Is it going to be a bound value that needs to be evaluated? Or is it going to be an event handler like we did down here with click? So you can see with the one-way bind, it's going to be the square brackets. With the event handler, it's going to be parentheses. An ng model is actually a two-way bind, so it's actually a combination of the one-way plus the event handler. And so in that case, we have the square bracket with the parentheses, which is referred to as banana brackets. Okay, so there's our unordered list. If we save that, let it compile here, now you can see we have our unordered list again. And if we actually come in and view the DOM, you'll see our unordered list here. One thing I always tell people you want to keep in mind when working with this stuff is always check the DOM structure. A lot of times web developers will only look at the output here and think, oh, it looks the way I thought it was supposed to look, so I must be done. That's not true. You want to definitely go in. Remember, when you're working with things like Angular or any other UI component, library, framework, whatever, it's not so much about what you see on the screen. It's about what the DOM structure is. CSS is all about with what you see on the screen in terms of styling and layout and stuff like that. With JavaScript stuff, it's all about manipulating the DOM and making sure you have the correct DOM structure. So always be sure to double check your DOM structure to make sure your components are working as expected. Now, let's jump into our final one we're going to push out here. We're going to pull out the form. So we'll come into here, we'll create ourselves a new file. For this one, I'm building a form that's not really general purpose, it's really just for colors. So I'll give it a more specific name, colorform.ts. And we're going to once again say import component. But this time we're going to be importing output and event emitter. The color form isn't receiving data, it's outputting data. So it needs a different set of decorators and classes to be able to output that information. So we'll say import component, import output, and we're going to import something called event emitter. There we go. From at Angular core. And then we'll come into here and say at component. We'll do ourselves a little selector here. We're going to just call it color form. Once again, we'll need a template. There we go. And let me switch that to double quotes there real quick. Cool. So now I'm going to come back over to app component. I don't have to recode the whole form. I just have to pull the one out of here. So I'll pull that out, pop back over to here. There's my form. Now I'm going to come into here and say export class color form. If I could type right, there we go. Okay. Now, you'll notice I have my new color value that I'm tracking here on ng model. I'll just simply come over to here, pull that piece of code out of there, pop it into here. So now I've got my new color. So that's going to collect my new color value, but now I need a way to output it. Okay. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to come into here, we're going to create a special property. We're just going to call it on color. So we'll say at output, public on color, and this is going to be of type event emitter. In fact, we can actually just say new event emitter. If you actually do assign a value as part of the declaration, it'll infer the type from the initial value, and you don't have to be explicit in always specifying the type. For example, I could drop the colon string there if I wanted to. Okay, so I'm going to say public on color. All right, new event emitter. This is going to be a generic type, so it'll output a string value. So there we go. Now I'm going to come into here, and I'm going to set up my add color function. So we'll say public. But I'm actually going to rename add color. If you think about it, the purpose of color form is just to collect color data. It's not really all about trying to add. The form itself doesn't really care what we do with the color after we collect it. It just needs to collect it. So we'll just simply say save color, and that'll be the name of our function here. And I'll come into here and change this to say save color. Okay. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take the color we typed into new color, and we want to emit it out of the component. Okay, so we'll do this.onColor.emit this.newColor. And that's actually going to trigger the event handler that's passed into the component and give it the color that we typed in. And then I'll simply reinitialize that to new color, or reinitialize new color to an empty string, so the form field is now empty. So I'm going to save that. You'll see the red squigglies here. The one little issue I run into with Visual Studio Code from time to time is that it doesn't recognize that decorators are supported. And my configuration is set up to say that decorators are supported, so it shouldn't really be giving me the error. but it's kind of weird. Like the error will just kind of pop up and kind of come and go. So if you're ever running into this issue in working with Visual Studio Code, I'm not really sure 100% how to fix it, because like I say, I think I fix it and it goes away and then it kind of comes back at some point in the future. But this is the only negative experience I've ever had in terms of working with Angular and Visual Studio Code, is the occasional failure of this linting mechanism here with the experimental support for decorators. But there's actually nothing wrong with this code at all, and you can see it actually compiled successfully down here. So now I need to register color form with my module once again. So we'll come into here, and we're going to just kind of copy this whole thing, save ourselves a little typing, and we'll say color form, and change this to color form. There we go. I'm going to take that color form right there, pass it right into declarations. You can kind of see once you get the flow down, it's really not too bad. It's just kind of going through the same process for registering things. Now we're going to come into here, and I'm going to say color form. All right, there we go. And we're going to set up a little event handler on color, so when we get an actual color from the form, you can name this thing anything you want. In terms of, it could be like on submit color, on save color. I just called it on color. And I want to have it run the add color function. However, as part of running the add color function, I want to capture that event value, if you remember, the event value being passed out. To do that, I'm going to use a special token called $event. And that'll capture whatever data is emitted, the new color, and make it available inside of add color when this runs. So I'll put in a little parameter here called new color string, and then I can simply just refer to that new color. And of course, I don't need to reinitialize the form field here because, well, I'm not inside the form. So I can delete that. There we go. So now I have my add color. It's going to capture the new color value that's emitted, concat it to the array. When it concats to the array, it'll actually pass the new array into unordered list, and everything should be updated. So let's take a look at what we've got here. So I've got my form, and I'm going to zoom out a little. There we go. We'll add our new color, purple, and I'm going to click Add Color, and you can see it adds it to the list. So we have the same behavior as before, but now instead of having everything in one big file, we've moved it out. Not only that, we've created a tool header component that you could actually reuse if you had other tools. We have an unordered list component you could use if you had other unordered lists you wanted to build and just pass in an array of values. We have our color form, which is particular to this one application, okay, but it isolates the functionality of what it does out to its own thing, which makes it easier to actually build, support, maintain, unit test all these other components. This process of decomposing it into smaller components is the heart of component-based development. Well, I don't care whether you're doing AngularJS 1.5 and later, you're doing React, any other component-based Vue library framework. This is the process and thought mechanism you go through to build your UIs. And it may feel like a lot of work initially, and it is a lot of work. You are doing extra work to divide this up, but in the long run, you actually build something that is much more maintainable and extendable over the long haul than you would if you had everything crammed into one big page. Okay, so that right there is our application, and this code is going to get pushed up to GitHub by the end of the day. In fact, let me switch back over here to our little slide deck. And on our last little slide here, you'll see here's the URL. I'll take that URL, let me paste that into the chat window here. So there you go. You can go check out that. That actually not only will have the code from this webinar, has code from all the past webinars too, so you can check it out up there and pull down that code and take a look at those. You guys are also welcome to email me any questions you have after the webinar is over about Angular, React, JavaScript programming, UI development, anything you like. So there's my email address there in the chat window. Before we close things off for today, does anybody have any questions about anything? Anything that they would have like to have answered here during the webinar? If you do, just post it into the chat window here. We'll wait around for a minute or two and see if we have any questions. while we're waiting, I've got a couple of extra polls here I'd like to do if people have a moment or two just to kind of take them. I'd like to find out, how many of you all have used React before? How many folks have used React? Yeah, if you've if you're really trying to decide, do you use Angular or do you use React moving forward for your next big web project that you're doing, that can be a hard question to answer. I love both of them. I think they're both great libraries and great frameworks. Obviously, this particular webinar is about Angular, so I'm highlighting the features of Angular. But I can highlight just as many features for React and say, hey, do it with React because React does it this way and it's better to do it this way. They're both really, really nice frameworks. I will tell you this. I highly recommend choosing a very popular framework like an Angular or React or a Vue.js to build your UI stuff. I don't recommend building your own stuff from the ground up. You don't need to resolve all the same problems that other people have already solved. There's lots of awesome solutions out there, and it's better to use tested, supported, debugged code than it is to try to write your own stuff and have to reinvent the wheel, and then your stuff isn't even debugged or supported by others. And the nice thing about using things like Angular is you can actually find people in the marketplace who know Angular. You can hire people who do Angular. If you use your own framework or use some other really, really less popular framework, it's hard to find people, and then you have to train them and everything else. Whereas if you use one of these big popular ones, you get all the great benefits, and you can actually find people who know how to use them, and that can be a real benefit. I think probably for most of us, at the end of the day, the reason we write code is to help make a profit or make money for our organizations that we're working with. So the purpose of the code is really to generate revenue, not just to write code for the sake of writing code. And so we want to make sure we're using really awesome solutions that are really cost efficient for the people who are paying us. And once you get good with React and Angular and stuff like that, it's really cost efficient. You'll read a lot of stuff out there on the web that talks about what a pain Webpack is, or what a pain it is to have to do transpiling, or how hard it is to learn Angular, all that other stuff. I will tell you this. Yes, there is a learning curve, but whatever you implement, whatever you build, you will end up paying the price of the learning curve somewhere. You'll either pay the price for building your own thing and having to learn it and teach it to others and debug it all. You'll either pay the price of not using the latest JavaScript technologies, and then in the future you eventually have to upgrade and you have all this ES5 code laying around that you wanted to use because you just didn't want to use a transpiler. There's no way of getting around that there's going to be some pain. But I will tell you this, once you master an Angular or you master a React and then you want to switch from one to the other, it is so much easier than you think. And once you figure out how Webpack or Rollup or transpilers work, setting them up is easy. I remember setting up my first Angular 2 project. I think I spent more time getting Webpack to work than actually learning Angular 2. But once I figured out how Webpack worked and I got it working and it could do what I wanted it to do, it was amazing. And now I can set up Webpack in a matter of moments. In fact, most of it's copy and paste on the configuration. I don't spend endless hours trying to reconfigure Webpack. It was a one-time learning curve that's yielded tremendous benefits to my web programming. So be careful about all the blog posts you read out there. People are downing all the new web stuff and all the changes. I don't know about you guys in the webinar, but the reason I do software development is I love learning new stuff. I love building cool and new things. If I had to write the same piece of code every single day, every day my whole life, it would be boring, right? So embrace the change that comes with JavaScript because it's really awesome what you can do with it, all right? So looking at our poll results here, 85% have not used React and 15% have. I got one last little poll here, and then we'll call it quits for the webinar since we don't seem to, let's see, here we go. Now we've got some questions. Let me do this last little poll, then I'll answer a couple of questions here. So let's launch the poll. How many folks here have used Vue.js before? All right, so it looks like most people have not used Vue. So let's take a look at a couple of questions here before we run out the door. What did I use to generate the folder structure? That's a great question. I actually created it myself. I create projects. When I create my projects, I create the folder structure the way that works for me. I don't particularly like using Angular CLI. I like to kind of know how all the parts and pieces and stuff work. And so I actually prefer to set all that up myself and understand all the parts and pieces. It takes more time to do that, but I find that working with these technologies is that much easier because I actually know like what it's doing. So I kind of recommend to everybody skip the Angular CLI and actually go learn how to set up Webpack. It'll do a lot for you, because especially if you ever move to things like React and stuff like that, for all of those technologies you're going to be using Webpack as well. So it's good to go learn how that actually works. Let's see here. Recommended lists of VS Code plugins. Actually, I can. So here are the plugins that I use. Let me close the poll so you guys can see my screen here. All right. I actually use ESLint for any JavaScript files that I have going on. I've got editor config for just regular editor configuration. I've got I have an NPM plugin so that I get some NPM help stuff in my code when I'm writing, when I'm working with NPM package JSON files and stuff like that, which you will be doing with Angular. I have a Sass lint plugin that I use for linting my Sass files, which I use with Angular. TS lint's the big one. That's the one that you really want. And then I've got my VS Code icons. And of course, you want your extension for assembly language as well. No, I'm just kidding. No assembly language extension for Angular. All right. Let's see here. Thank you, Don, for speaking up about the my missing angle bracket there. Let's see here. Okay, so what happens is the reason that the colors updated itself when I clicked Add Color was because the way that the change detection mechanism works is that once you complete the asynchronous operation of clicking the button of saying add color and then it runs the code to update the model, Angular actually goes through a change detection process where it detects a change on the model and then triggers the UI to be re-rendered based upon that change. And so that's kind of the auto magical part that's happening there. When you pass in that event handler, it's basically wrapping it to trigger the change detection. I had a question here about demoing the Webpack configuration. If you come into the config folder here, you'll see all of my Webpack files. The part that you'd probably be the most interested in is webpack.common. And if you come into here, it's got all the various configurations that I have for configuring transpilers and processing things. I encourage you to take a look at that file. I've got everything pretty well commented. So it actually explains to you like what it's doing. This is the process I went through when I was first creating Webpack stuff, I don't know, a year and a half, 2 years ago. I went through and documented it, and I try to keep it updated as I increment through Webpack. This is using Webpack 2. On my current React applications I'm building, I'm using Webpack 3. So you can check out the latest versions of that. Let's see. Pre-built app. So I had a pre-built structure here. To try to build completely everything from scratch is a lot of files. It's a lot of work to build that initial Angular app. That's one of the big complaints people have about using these modern technologies. Just pull down my code and start from there, or use Angular CLI or something like that. There's a bunch of different starter projects. Minimum browser requirements for Angular 4. That's a great question. I used to be able to answer that question for everything I worked with all the time back when everybody was using IE. So I could tell you like what library or framework worked with this version of IE versus another. Do not hold me to this. I want to say all of this should work with IE9 and higher because we're transpiling out to ES5. It is always possible I'm incorrect in that answer, but I want to say IE9 and higher because we're transpiling out to ES5. I don't think there's anything that we're using that can't be transpiled back to IE9. Of course, with Chrome, Firefox, Safari, nobody really knows what version they're using anyways, because it all auto-updates. The same thing is true for Edge. So it should work. You can get a recording. The recording of the webinars will be available at wintellect.com. You can go there and check out that. Let's see. API calls. So that would be using the HTTP service. We're not covering that in this particular webinar, but you can check out the HTTP service at the Angular website, and that'll show you how to make GET requests and PUT requests and all post requests, that kind of thing. So controllers and directives. You can do what you. So if you're from the AngularJS background, when you think of a controller, I want you to think of the actual component class here. In fact, if you've ever used controller as in AngularJS, you probably know that the controller gets newed up, like the controller function is viewed as a constructor function, and it gets newed up. Well, that's what we have here, except that instead of calling it a constructor function, they're now called classes. So this class is really the equivalent of the controller of AngularJS. The directive part is the component. The fact that this whole thing is like a component is basically an AngularJS directive that has a template and uses isolated scope and uses bind to controller set to true. So that would be the equivalent of AngularJS with this component here. You can do things like attribute directives and structural directives, which would be similar to, let's say, like ngRepeat or ngIf or ngClass or ngStyle. You can do things like that in Angular 4, but you will find that because most of the directives people created in AngularJS were all template related, the components are really the big focus here. But yes, you can build those other types of directives as well. Okay. All right. So thank you, one of the attendees. Thank you, Don, for your comment there. I appreciate it. All right. So that kind of concludes all of the questions here. I hope that this provided some new information for everybody. Like I said, don't hesitate to email me at the email address, and the code will be posted up to GitHub later today. It won't be posted up immediately after the webinar, but later on today you can visit that link, and it should be up there, and you can check out the code for that. And be sure to head back to Wintellect. They've got all types of awesome webinars on a variety of topics, and you can learn a ton of things. Even myself, I go and actually watch the webinars too and actually learn things about other topics that I don't know a whole lot about, and I've actually found them to be very eye-opening. It's actually an amazing resource for being free for just the general public to come check out. So I appreciate everyone being a part of this one. I have some future webinars coming out in the future. If you see me have one up there being hosted, please be sure to check it out. Always happy to have folks come and learn more about JavaScript, JavaScript frameworks and libraries and stuff. And so I appreciate the opportunity to work with you guys today. So everybody take care. This kind of concludes the webinar. Best of luck, and don't hesitate to email me if you have any questions.